Now, under the emergency economic measures, the bank accounts of protesters and donors could be frozen without prior judicial authorization. Don't you think that that could affect their confidence in Canada as a place to make their investments?
I wouldn't say so. I think that what you had was illegal conduct by individuals and therefore actions taken in response to that illegal conduct. That is not a corollary to a law-abiding investor.
But prior to the declaration of emergency, there wasn't a law that authorized the freezing of those bank accounts, right?
There was illegal conduct at the time.
So the emergency economic measure wasn't necessary to take that action then?
I think others are best placed. That is not a Global Affairs Canada area of expertise, nor is it my area of expertise.
But don't you think that responding to a political protest by extrajudicially preventing people from accessing their own funds would deter people from wanting to place their money in the Canadian financial system?
I think that is, I couldn't really speak to that, but I think investors would be looking at much broader considerations in making decisions to invest in a particular country.
So you don't think that subjecting property rights and the financial system really as a whole to rules made without legislative deliberation or any sort of judicial pre-authorization system would concern a potential investor?
Again, I think the Emergencies Act is a very special consideration that, to my knowledge, is not applied to investors.
Given that we've heard from police, who are the experts in policing matters, that they've said that they could respond to the protest without the Emergencies Act, for the purposes of matters directly under the concern of Global Affairs Canada, the Emergency Act wasn't necessary for something outside of policing the protests, correct?
I've already answered your question.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you.
Okay.
The opinion around the security and intelligence community was that the paragraph that you read was factually correct. There were indications of potential violent acts, IMVE adherence that were certainly engaging online and were making threats online. And we needed to be mindful that those threats could materialize at any moment, given the growing nature of the situation, both in Ottawa and across the country.
That not a single diplomat from a foreign state was physically assaulted by a protester, correct?
I am not aware of physical assaults, but we were always concerned about that possibility, given the reports that we had heard of quite a number of physical assaults during that period.
Well, this commission has heard evidence with respect to physical assaults during the period of the protest that there was a total of 5 charges in total. So that's from the beginning of the protest until the end, and I understand your concern, but you have no evidence that any diplomat was physically assaulted by any of the protesters in Ottawa. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. And I also understand that you have no evidence that any of the protesters in downtown Ottawa verbally threatened to harm any of the diplomats. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it was always a concern that that might happen, and hence our concern about being able to live up to our Vienna Convention obligations.
Is the undermining of Canada's reputation and protests in Canada, in your view, is that a security threat under Section 2 of the CSIS Act?
So I'm not an expert on Section 2 of the CSIS Act. Our primary interest from a Global Affairs Canada perspective when it comes to security is really thinking about our economic security. And when you consider that the international trade in goods and services is valued at over 60% of our GDP, we were actually very concerned about the economic security of this country.
Right, and the country's reputation, right?
Yes.
Okay, so how was the country's reputation when various ministers and the Prime Minister announced that there was foreign funding coming from the United States and that this was undermining Canadian democracy? And I've seen in the disclosure and others that wasn't the United States, some of sitting members of their government, including their ministries, weren't they a little upset about that when it was accused that the U.S. was financing this protest? Weren't they upset? I understood they would.
I can't speak to the views of all members of the U.S. administration. I can just say that there were a number of conversations that were had by Canadian government officials, including the Prime Minister, where there were actually concerns about U.S. funding through the platforms that we had discussed earlier.
Right, and you can agree with me that there's nothing wrong with a Canadian donating to an American cause and an American donating to a Canadian cause with respect to funding protests or charities. There's nothing illegal about that, is there?
I think the concern was that some of the activities of the protesters were illegal.
Right, and you're saying that was illegal was the blockade, correct?
Yes, the blockades
Right.
Were illegal.
Right, and the being in downtown Ottawa?
It wasn't a matter of being in downtown Ottawa that was illegal per se. In fact, I think in this democracy, we fiercely protect the ability to peacefully and lawfully protest. It was the matter of the illegal aspects that were a concern.
So what was the illegal aspect to you of the protests in downtown Ottawa? Can you tell me what the illegal aspect it is that you're referring to?
I think that on matters of what particular aspects were illegal, it is probably better to speak to other witnesses.
Well, we have, and I'm still confused. So what is your understanding, your personal understanding of what the illegal activities in downtown Ottawa were?
I think this is probably a question that is better directed to other witnesses.
So you were concerned about Canada's reputation due to illegal activity in downtown Ottawa, but you don't know what that activity is. Is that correct?
It's not a matter of not knowing. It is a matter of others being better placed to speak to this.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. So where it says violent incidents, so it says violent incidents and threats of violence and protests and arrests, related to the protests have been reported across Canada. The RCMP's recent seizure of a cache of firearms with a large quantity of ammunition in Coutts, Alberta, indicated that there are elements within the protests that have intentions to engage in violence. Ideologically motivated violent extremism adherents may feel empowered by the level of disorder resulting from the protests. Violent online rhetoric, increased threats against public officials, and the physical presence of ideological extremists at protests also indicate that there is a risk of serious violence and the potential for lone actor attackers to conduct terrorism attacks. The question for both of you, can you provide any comments on this as to whether these are accurate facts to your knowledge?
I believe them to be true. And in a more general sense, I will underline a point made by my colleague that this is a evolving situation, and the focus on violent extremism has shifted from coming from abroad to domestic. And in the context in which we are, and I've said this, under-equipped and indeed not empowered to do the work that we need to do to pay attention to what people's intentions are. I would note that since 2014, there has been significant domestic violent extremism. I believe the numbers are 26 people killed and 40 injured in over a dozen attacks, often by lone wolf actors with no prior indication that they would do so. So this is a very serious concern.
And Mr. Rochon?
The only thing I would add is that the opinion around the security and intelligence community was that the paragraph that you read was factually correct. There were indications of potential violent acts, IMVE adherents that were certainly engaging online and were making threats online. And we needed to be mindful that those threats could materialize at any moment, given the growing nature of the situation, both in Ottawa and across the country.